Hey everybody, this is the last of our sort of supplemental videos. So from this point on, you'll just have one more video in which I respond to your questions about the Catherine of Siena reading, and then we're just about done at that point. So just hang in there a little bit longer. This is a video about medieval Judaism and medieval Jewish thought. And I don't really need to give an explanation for why I think that's important because I really kind of gave that account at the beginning of the medieval Islamic thought video. I'll just remind you that on the one hand, what I'm trying to do is show that medieval Judaism has a lot of really interesting and unique features that mark it out from Islam and Christianity. Um, but on the other hand, I also want to show that just as we've seen with Christianity and Islam, medieval Judaism had an incredibly lively intellectual culture in the Middle Ages and was again subject to some of the same kind of dynamics and propensities that we've seen in the other two religions. And in fact, in the course of this video, I'll mention a couple of instances in which we can actually point to the influence of a Jewish thinker on a Christian and vice versa. Now, the first thing to note, to be very clear about, is that medieval Judaism, for the most part, is, and there's one important exception, which I'll mention in a moment. But for the most part, when we're talking about medieval Judaism, we are talking about rabbinic Judaism. Now, what does that mean? What do we mean by rabbinic Judaism? Rabbinic Judaism is the type of Judaism that emerges sort of after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and that the type of religion that, or the type of Judaism that produces the Mishnah and the Talmud, and that sort of recognizes the Mishnah and the Talmud as authoritative texts. So let me say something about those texts very quickly. The Mishnah is a collection of deliberations on the law by esteemed rabbis of roughly the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. Okay, and the Mishnah is predicated on this notion of the oral Torah. So there's this idea emerging that at Sinai, God revealed a number of laws to Moses, of course. Some were written down, and those are the ones that you can find in the Pentateuch. But there are other laws that Moses received that he sort of propagated orally. And so a number of the laws that are discussed in the Mishnah come from the so-called oral Torah. So that's what the Mishnah is, a book, sort of collecting the learned arguments and debates that these rabbis had amongst themselves. Okay, and the Mishnah itself basically comes together and congeals sometime around the 3rd century. And right around this time, there's a changing perception about the rabbis themselves. Prior to the Mishnah, the rabbis who were teachers were regarded as sages who deserved respect, but not necessarily as sort of supernatural figures. But starting in the 3rd century, rabbis are increasingly regarded as not just holy and learned, but actually supernatural, both in terms of their powers and their mystical insights. So that's the Mishnah. Then there's the Talmud, or more correctly, the Talmuds. There's the Palestinian Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. We're going to focus on the Babylonian because it's more important, it's more influential, and it's sort of came together around the year 600. The Talmuds are basically commentaries of a sort on the Mishnah. And they're preserving, the Talmuds are preserving the sayings of the rabbis from the period from roughly 200 to 500. Okay. The Babylonian Talmud, as I said, was the most influential of the two and was the longest book produced in all of late antiquity, longer even than Gregory's Moralia in Job. The Babylonian Talmud, when it's printed, is something like 6,200 pages. Okay, so this is a virtual kind of encyclopedia. So these books, the Mishnah and especially the Talmud, become the heart of rabbinic Judaism. But that's not to suggest that the Torah, and by the Torah I mean the Pentateuch, that's not to suggest that the Torah is somehow less important. It's just that both the written and the oral Torah were regarded as equally authoritative. Okay. So what we're dealing with when we talk about medieval Judaism is rabbinic Judaism, Judaism that in some ways has three sacred texts, the Torah itself, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. Now, before going any further, given the fact that this class is entitled Medieval Theology, you might expect to be able to talk about medieval Jewish theology. But that's kind of problematic. It's not clear that it's even right to talk about medieval Jewish theology because in many ways theology, the way we often use that term, is a kind of specifically and uniquely Christian construct. Only Christians write systematic theologies comparable to like Thomas's Summa Theologiae. Okay, Jewish thinkers are not writing that kind of theology. Muslim thinkers, for that matter, in the Middle Ages, are not writing that kind of theology. It's not a value judgment. It's rather that Jewish and Islamic thinkers during the Middle Ages didn't see those kinds of writings as being sort of most profitable. Okay, I think we can talk about Jewish theology or Jewish theologians in the Middle Ages as long as we acknowledge that Judaism didn't use the category theology or theologians in quite the same way that Christianity did. Okay, so medieval Judaism. And from this point on, everything's going to be divided fairly neatly between the early Middle Ages and the high Middle Ages. Those are the two periods I want to look at. And so I just want to give you a kind of bird's eye view of the major intellectual and spiritual developments within Judaism during those two periods. So let's start with the early Middle Ages. Two really important developments with respect to early medieval Judaism. One is the decline of Hellenistic Judaism, which was exemplified in figures like Philo of Alexandria, who was a Greek speaker, wrote in Greek, all that. Hellenistic Judaism declines, and conversely, the Hebrew language, both in worship and in scholarship, has this kind of resurgence, along with the rabbinic outlook that I've already been talking about. Okay, so that's an important development. I think one of the most important things to grasp when we're talking about early medieval Judaism is that the vast majority of early medieval Jews found themselves under Muslim rule and therefore subject to the influence of Islamic culture. Okay. This is why I did the Islamic thought video first, because that sort of provides the backdrop for Jewish thought in the early Middle Ages. And during this period, at least, Islamic philosophy and culture is much more influential on Jewish thought than Christian theology and culture. Many Jewish scholars during this period had a working facility in Arabic. Very few could write or even read Latin. So just to give you one example of a way in which Islamic thought influenced Judaism, it would seem that Islamic kalam, or philosophical apologetics, was an influence on a number of the Jewish philosophers of this period. Okay, one other important and perhaps somewhat unexpected development to mention is I find this whole story absolutely fascinating. There is a group that emerges. There's a kind of schism that happens in Judaism in the early Middle Ages. There is the rise of a group known as the Karaites, Karaites, Karaites. Sometime around the 8th century or so, the actual genesis of the movement is a bit murky, but we'll say 8th century. And the term Karaite is actually a fairly broad term that includes a number of different groups. But what held these groups together, what they had in common, was that basically they rejected rabbinic tradition almost entirely. So this rabbinic Judaism that is taking shape in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the Karaites are rejecting that. And in fact, the word Karaite is related to the Hebrew word for scripture, because this was a group, much like the Protestants in the 16th century, who said, all these human traditions have kind of encrusted scripture. And so what we need to do is to sort of tear away, remove that crust, remove those human traditions, and get back to scripture, what we would call the Old Testament. Okay, so it's a kind of Protestant movement, but within Judaism. Now, one reason I'm mentioning the Karaites is because the Karaites boasted a number of scholars and a number of biblical scholars, and they promoted a style of biblical exegesis that was more sort of focused on literary context and grammar than rabbinic interpretation tended to be. There were also Karaites who wrote verse-by-verse commentaries on books of the Bible, which was not really a typical Jewish genre of the time. You could find that in Christian literature, but not so much in Jewish. So it's important to be aware that the Karaites are emerging, and this, of course, is going to cause a great deal of turmoil in the Jewish community. I should mention, by the way, there are still tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Karaite Jews even today. All right, one major development that we see in the early Middle Ages is the beginning of medieval Jewish philosophy. Now, there's nothing intrinsically strange about Jews doing philosophy. You could even look at some of the wisdom literature in the Old Testament and perhaps conjecture about the influence of philosophy on those. But Judaism was certainly the first Abrahamic religion to offer a kind of philosophical account of itself, namely in the works of, I just mentioned him, Philo of Alexandria. But after Philo, who was basically a contemporary of Jesus, after Philo, there's not really a very robust Jewish philosophical tradition. Jewish religious discourse becomes essentially discourse on the Talmud. Now, the Talmud would occasionally, raise certain kind of philosophical questions, but not in a systematic way. And the point of the Talmud and the point of discourse about the Talmud is not to pursue philosophical questions for their own sake, but to better understand the oral teaching of the Jewish sages of the past. Okay, so you have a pretty long hiatus. I mean, a roughly 800-year hiatus where there's very little you could point to and say that's Jewish philosophy. But Jewish philosophy does, in fact, revive. It revives in the 10th century. And this happens for a number of reasons. There are extramural controversies going on. So, Jews are trying to defend themselves and sometimes go on the attack when it comes to Islam, but other religions too. And then there's the intramural Jewish conflict that the Karaites had generated. And so in a way, Jewish philosophy, as it is revived starting in the 10th century, is an attempt to adjudicate some of those religious disputes, both extramural and intramural, by appealing to reason rather than by appealing to authority, which is never going to get you very far when you're arguing with somebody who belongs to a different religious tradition or to a different sect of your religion or whatever. So let me just mention one name, a person who has been described as the father of medieval Jewish philosophy of religion, and that is Saadia Gaon, Saadia space Gaon. And the Gaon is a kind of honorific title. That was the word for the head of the academy of Sura in Mesopotamia. So Saadia is his name. He was from Egypt, originally lived in a number of different places, and as I said, originally or ultimately wound up in Babylonia. Very hard to overstate the importance of Saadia Gaon. He was one of the great Talmudic scholars of his day, as you would expect, but he was also a great biblical scholar. He produced an Arabic translation of the Bible and produced a number of commentaries on the Bible as well. He was also an apologist and a polemicist. He wrote works against the Karaites. He wrote against Christian Trinitarianism. He wrote against the Zoroastrians. He wrote against the Islamic understanding of Revelation. His masterpiece is generally considered the Book of Beliefs and Opinions. And let me briefly read a quote from that book. Saadia writes, "The reader of this book should know that we inquire into and speculate on the teachings of our religion for two reasons. First, to find out for ourselves what we have learned as imparted knowledge from the prophets of God. And secondly, to be able to refute anyone who argues against us concerning anything to do with religion. In this way, we engage in speculation and inquiry so as to make our own what the Lord has taught us by way of imparted knowledge." Now, that may not exactly be faith-seeking understanding in the Christian scholastic sense, but it's not entirely different either. He is a very proud Jew. He believes that Judaism is the true religion. All other religions are false in some important way. But for him, the content of Jewish revelation, what was revealed to Moses, the content is identical with the content of reason. Okay? Now, you could ask the question, well, why have revelation at all, right? If what is revealed in Judaism is simply what reason can check out, why have revelation at all? And he has some interesting answers. That there's some pedagogical value for those with limited reasoning skills. So if you're not perhaps the best reasoner in the world, revelation is certainly going to come in handy. And it also kind of guides philosophers. I mean, no one reasons perfectly, not even philosophers. And so revelation kind of sets the guardrails for Jewish philosophy. All right, so that's just a little bit about Saadia. Oh, one last thing about him. There's an important implication here for biblical interpretation. because revelation is always perfectly coextensive with what reason teaches. Anytime the literal sense of a given passage in Scripture is irrational in some way, you must bypass the literal sense and find a kind of non-literal, figurative interpretation that better accords with the rationality. And that sounds a little familiar. That sounds a lot like our good friend Origen. Okay, that's all I want to say about Jewish thought in the early Middle Ages. So now we move into the High Middle Ages, so 1000 to 1300. Something important happens as we move from the early to the High Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, almost all of the really authoritative Jewish teachers could be found in Babylonia, in Mesopotamia. But those great academies close in the middle of the 11th century. And from that point on, for the duration of the High Middle Ages, authority is going to be diffused among various centers in the Mediterranean and Northern European world, including places like Egypt, Spain, France, and Germany. Those tend to be the most important regions in terms of boasting Jewish teachers who could actually make a legitimate claim to authority. But we have to remember there is no central Jewish institution to kind of police these different scholars. So there's nothing at all equivalent to the papacy, for instance. Okay. Even so, there's going to be a handful of Jewish scholars who emerge that can command almost universal respect and deference. And one of those scholars is known as Rashi, Rashi. He lived from 1040 to 1105. His full name is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki. Rashi is an acronym of his Hebrew initials, so we're going to go with Rashi, and that's normally what he's called. He was from France. He was from Troyes, southeast of Paris. And so he is a Western European thinker. Now, in addition to Hebrew, he could speak and write in French, but he did not have any Latin. I mean, remember, Latin is a dead language. It's really known only to Christian scholars and clerics. Rashi became an incredibly influential figure, thanks largely to his expositions of the Bible and the Babylonian Talmud. He wrote a commentary on the Bible that included everything but Chronicles. I mean, that, of course, in itself is quite an achievement. But part of what makes Rashi important is the manner in which he interpreted the Bible. He really stressed the Peshat, P-E-S-H-A-T, the Peshat, the plain meaning of the text, using the tools of, yes, reason, but also of philology. You have to read even biblical texts in their literary and historical context. So he's bringing this sort of grammatical, literary approach to the interpretation of the Bible, which is going to stress and foreground the literal sense of Scripture. Now, that doesn't mean that Rashi thought that you always had to interpret everything literally and only literally, but the stress, the emphasis is going to be on the plain meaning of the text. And his approach to the Bible was influential on Christian exegetes, especially in the later Middle Ages, who were trying to move away from some of the elaborate allegorical interpretation of the Bible and to focus more on the plain sense of the text. So in addition to his work on the Bible, he also wrote a thorough commentary on almost the entirety of the Babylonian Talmud. And remember how long I said the Babylonian Talmud was. To this day, Rashi's commentary on the Talmud is still the standard commentary. And his goal was not to add to the Talmud, which was, long enough, but to make a very complicated, labyrinthine text more accessible to a broader Jewish readership. I should also mention that he had a very illustrious grandson named Rashbam, Rashbam, who was also a great biblical scholar who was, if anything, more insistent than even Rashi on reading biblical text in their historical and literary context. So Rashi, one of the great figures of the High Middle Ages in terms of Jewish thought. I want to move on to one of the other great illustrious figures of High Medieval Judaism, and that is Maimonides. Maimonides, however, was not primarily a biblical scholar. He was a philosopher and is arguably the most important, greatest Jewish philosopher who ever lived. Now, he's born about a generation after the death of Rashi, so his dates are 1135 to 1204. Okay, so we're kind of in the same general time as Peter Abelard, Bernard of Clairvaux, people like that. Now, he was from the Mediterranean region rather than Northern Europe. He was born in Cordoba, which was the capital and cultural center of Al-Andalus, which is the name for medieval Spain under Islamic domination. Now, when he was born, the dynasty that was ruling, the Islamic dynasty that was ruling in Cordoba, was relatively tolerant with respect to Jews. But when he was 10, Cordoba was captured by a more sort of fanatical dynasty, Islamic dynasty. And eventually he and his family leave Cordoba after possibly nominally converting to Islam. That's a controversial topic that I'm not going to touch. He winds up in Egypt, and his day job, as it were, was as a physician at the court of the Islamic ruler in Cairo. But we're not talking about him because of his medical knowledge or practice. We're talking about him because of his philosophy and religious thought. So let me just mention a couple of his landmark works. He wrote tons of important stuff. One of his most famous books is The Guide for the Perplexed, which you can see here. In a way, he is extending the claim that Saadia Gaon had made several centuries before, which is that Torah and philosophy are perfectly compatible. He wants to show that even the most apparently irrational laws of the Pentateuch actually have a rational basis. Okay. Now, for him, this is 12th century. So for him, when he talks about philosophy, he is largely talking about the philosophy of Aristotle. He thought that Aristotle was basically right about everything except maybe the eternity of the universe. So think about this. A century before Aquinas tries to baptize Aristotle, Maimonides tries to circumcise him. A second work I want to mention is called the Mishneh Torah, and that's Mishneeh Torah. The Mishnah that I talked about before, the 3rd century text, is Mishnah. Now, the Mishneh Torah, Maimonides wrote in Hebrew. Most of his works he wrote in a kind of Jewish form of Arabic, but he could write in Hebrew, and perhaps wrote this text in Hebrew because he was trying to reach a European Jewish audience that would not have had Arabic, but which would have had Hebrew. And what he's trying to do in this text is basically kind of create an encyclopedia of Talmudic and post-Talmudic Jewish literature, and sort of organize that massive mountain of material that had been created. Material, of course, that I'll stress, was intended to help Jews faithfully observe the law, both the law written in the written Torah and the law that was orally transmitted. Finally, he did write a commentary on the Mishnah with an A, and that text is probably most famous because in it he drew up the sort of what's called the 13 fundamental principles of Judaism, a kind of Jewish creed. And Jews, generally not as big on creeds as Christians, but Maimonides sort of created this creed, and it actually became incorporated into the liturgy of the synagogue. So that, of course, suggests that he was a very influential figure and that he commanded a great deal of respect. However, he was a controversial figure. He was attacked during his lifetime. He was attacked especially after he died and decades after his death. Just to give you one example of a belief that was controversial, he basically understood resurrection in a kind of metaphorical way. He understood resurrection not in a bodily way, but in a purely spiritual way. And that bothered a number of his Jewish contemporaries. He also tended to kind of explain away or allegorize miracle stories in the Bible and not just accept them literally. And that bothered some people too. So some scholars have pointed out that the Abelard-Bernard debate in Christianity around the same time is paralleled by some of these debates that Maimonides stirred up around the same period. Now, many of Maimonides' critics were of a sort of more mystical bent, and that brings me to the last thing that I want to discuss, which is Jewish mysticism. Now, Jewish mysticism is not something new. It's not as if there was no Jewish mysticism prior to the High Middle Ages. And I'm just not going to, you're just going to take my word for it. There was, okay? But around the dawn of the 13th century, we see stirrings of a new mystical movement in Judaism known typically as Kabbalah. That's Kabbalah, Kabbalah. And the hotspots for Kabbalah were in Western Europe. They were in northern France, the stomping ground of Rashi. They were in Spain. And interestingly, in the Rhineland region as well. We've already seen what a fertile region that was for Christian mysticism. Turns out to be pretty fertile for Jewish mysticism as well. So Kabbalah basically becomes a byword for Jewish mysticism. It literally means reception, as in the reception of ancient wisdom that had been lost. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The first point I want to make about Kabbalah is it really was a kind of alternative to the philosophical rationalism that Maimonides and others represented. Okay, they're both concerned with the same thing. Kabbalah, Maimonides, both very concerned with gaining knowledge of God. But Kabbalah went about acquiring that knowledge in very different ways. The best way to acquire knowledge about God for the Kabbalist was to sort of contemplate concealed meanings of ancient texts, especially of the text of the Bible. Okay. So Kabbalah was always sort of an esoteric pursuit. In other words, it's not for everybody. Only certain kinds of people are going to have the aptitude, the ability to distill this sort of wisdom from these ancient texts. So let me just mention a couple of the most important characteristics of the Kabbalah. Let me go back to that etymology of the word, right? It means reception. Well, one of the things we see in Kabbalah is this duality of tradition and inspiration. What do I mean by that? I mean that the Kabbalah actually proposed a number of pretty fresh and original ideas, but they didn't present them as such, right? So Kabbalistic writers didn't sort of say, hey, I just had this new idea and I want to share it with you. No, they would try to present these ideas, which were often quite novel, in terms of continuity with the past. And let me give you a perfect example of this by talking about the Zohar, Zohar, the Zohar, the Book of Splendor. This was published in the last decades of the 13th century, so around the time of Aquinas and Bonaventure. The Zohar is made up of about 20 separate treatises written in a kind of stilted form of Aramaic. It's a big book, not quite Babylonian Talmud big, but like 12 volumes in English translation. Now, the Zohar was presented as the hidden wisdom of a 2nd century rabbi who is believed to have been directly inspired by Elijah. Now, scholars today are in basic agreement that actually the Zohar is more or less a book written by the 13th century Spanish mystic Moses de Leon, who had also written a number of mystical treatises in Hebrew under his own name. So that's what I mean when I talk about sort of the duality of tradition and inspiration. It's presented as tradition, but as a matter of fact, many of the ideas are of fairly recent vintage. In any case, the Zohar, you might be interested to know, will become considered by many Jews, including many Jews today, as the 3rd holiest book in all of Judaism, after the Torah itself and the Talmud. Okay, what else do we want to say about this? The Kabbalah, one of the things that stands out about it is that it posits a fairly sort of stark distinction between the unknown God and the known God. So God is eternally unknowable in the depths of his own self, as the scholar Sholem once said. So the preferred title for God among the Kabbalists was the infinite. Okay? God is infinite, therefore cannot really be known or comprehended in any way. So there's a strong kind of apophatic element in play. Now, of course, Jews, as did Christians and Muslims, attributed a number of qualities to God: wisdom, intelligence, love, and so on. But for the Kabbalists, these qualities refer not so much to God in God's self, but they refer rather to the creative kind of manifestations or emanations of God, which they talked about as God's spheres or God's regions. Now, this is not an entirely new concept for us. I mean, if you think about Dennis the Areopagite, he talks about how the divine names don't so much name God himself, but they name God's activities. Okay? But the Kabbalists are going to talk about it a little bit differently. They're going to talk about it more in sort of spatial terms. The attributes of God, like wisdom and intelligence, refer to these spheres that sort of unfold from God or emanate from God. Now, this might seem to actually jeopardize monotheism in some way. And that was one of the tasks the Kabbalists had to deal with. How does their sort of understanding of the progressive unfolding of God, how does that preserve monotheism? Another thing that is characteristic of the Kabbalah is a very strong interest in mythology. And I've already started to touch on that with this whole idea of the divine spheres and the sort of unfolding of these divine spheres. So there's a lot of interest in the sort of topography or geography of the heavenly realm. And this is one of a number of things that the Kabbalists had in common with the ancient Gnostics. Now, I'm not suggesting that Kabbalism is just Gnosticism medieval style. There are some real differences, but there are some similarities. There's interest in sort of mythology, particularly myths told about God and sort of how God develops or unfolds or unfurls. And also the general esoteric thrust, right? The idea that the wisdom that the Kabbalah has to offer is really not for everybody, but only people who have a certain kind of insight and who have been sort of prepared in a certain kind of way. The last thing I want to mention about the Kabbalah, I think, helps to explain why it was so successful and popular. It had an extremely positive attitude towards the Torah, towards the written Torah, which it saw as a kind of living organism that was forever generating more and more divine wisdom. So every jot and tittle, every syllable of the Torah has some deeper mystical significance. And so you need to get beyond the kind of literal interpretation of the text and delve into that mystical text. So again, we see a tension here if you think about Rashi. There's quite a big spectrum in medieval Jewish exegesis when it comes to the question of the literal interpretation. Kabbalah tends to be very positive about language and the ability of language to impart, and specifically the Hebrew language, I should say, but the ability of language to impart wisdom. I mean, God himself uses the Hebrew language as an instrument to communicate divine wisdom. So that should make us optimistic about the ability of language to convey truth and wisdom. Okay, I've gone on long enough. I will stop there. I hope I've given you some sense of just the sheer diversity of medieval Jewish thought, as well as its vitality, as well as the ways in which Jewish thinkers were having to think through questions that were not altogether different from the questions with which Christian and, in fact, Muslim thinkers were grappling.